Your name is Tom Cruise, and you are in another action movie again. So here's my spoiler alerts, my film reveal on the movie called Oblivion. It's the year like 2077, so it's like 70 years in the future. There has been wars, and supposedly they won. The side that Tom Cruise is on, the good guys win, or whatever you want to call them. They won, but they lost to Earth, so they had to go to Titan, which is the biggest moon on Jupiter that goes around Jupiter. I think it's Jupiter or Saturn, one of those bigger planets. Somehow they're able to habitat one of those moons to live on the moons, and the people they run off there. They run off to the moon in the future after the wars. You know, they have the wars and you have like big bombs that blow up the world and makes the world toxic. So toxic you can't live there, so you have to run away. And that's what they did. It's kind of like, spoiler alert, the movie, cartoon, Pixar movie Wall-E, which is about the future and the world became toxic and that. Maybe not because of war, but just because people like to have toxic in their life, like smoking and pollution, and that eventually messes up the world, started making trouble in their neighborhood, like Will Smith in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So, in this movie, Tom Cruise and his partner, this other girl, they are on Earth, monitoring the Earth for whatever the reason, making sure everything's okay. They have their daily routines, and they're there for like a few months or a few years on a mission. And when the movie starts, they're already almost at the end of their mission. They only have like 2 weeks, and so you have the girl, and she's up on the tower, and she's monitoring Tom Cruise, and Tom Cruise goes out in his daily routine. He goes on a little spaceship, and he also has like a little like a motorcycle, and he runs off and he makes sure that the different probes are running around and doing things that they're supposed to do. Probes are like robots that fly through the air, and they monitor the progress or not progress of the Earth, of how the Earth is healing after the wars from many years ago with all the pollution, to see if maybe they could start life again there, like they did in Wall-E. They wanted to go back to Earth and repopulate the Earth as soon as the Earth was not too corrupted with pollution in the Wall-E movie, and in this movie too, Oblivion, maybe. But then again, I don't exactly know what they were doing. They were on a mission. They were doing as they were told, supposedly, until Tom Cruise, he starts to discover things, and he finds like an old books, literature books of history books of like the Greek gods, and or Roman history of thousands of years ago, and he starts getting interested in history and things like that. And there were people on Earth, believe it or not, and he didn't really know this, but there was like people on Earth, and they were spying on him and watching what he was doing, and eventually he runs into them, and he runs into one of the main guys, Morgan Freeman, and then at first he doesn't know what to do, and he's like, oh no, these guys are bad, but one of the things that happens before he meets Morgan Freeman is that he finds these survivors in these time capsule, like they look like, what do you call it, that you're buried in, like a funeral tombstone thing, except it's like it has a life support and it keeps you alive, and but then the little probe starts shooting and killing them except for the one girl, this one lady, and he saves her and takes her back to their space station tower thing up high, like like what you see the buildings look like in the cartoon, the Jetsons. It's like that. It's up high. The Jetsons, meet the Jetsons. And then he finds out that this girl is his wife, because he's always haunted by these dreams of him living in New York City, but he thought he never lived in New York City. He thought that the whole world was blown up before he was even born. And he has these memory wipes, like they have these mandatory memory erasing things, kind of like what you do with the pen in Men in Black. You go, boom, you zap somebody with a pen in the movie Men in Black with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. You know how they fight the aliens and they make sure the aliens don't take over the world or make too much trouble in their neighborhood, kind of thing. Those movies, the Men in Black, the MIB, they have the pens. It erases people's memories. And in this movie, Oblivion, they are required to erase their memory every once in a while. I call that brainwashing. It's too bad, but they do what they're told to do, and that's what they do. But for some reason, he still remembers things, and it can't get out. Kind of like in Dollhouse. Spoiler alerts if you haven't seen Dollhouse. The star of that TV show is Echo, and she starts to remember things too from her past, from the different things that she's doing as a doll, which is like a slave, like a robot in the dollhouse where she just does what they tell him to do, except she doesn't really is supposed to remember because they kind of take her mind out of her body and they put in other minds because she's like a slave and she does whatever they tell her to do, but then she starts to remember and then things start to get ugly. And in this movie that I'm reviewing right now, Oblivion, he remembers things from his past, and that kind of messes up with his head, and he doesn't know what to do, but then he finds out that he had a wife, and he's like, oh man, I have a wife, and then he goes back to the surface, and he meets the people like Morgan Freeman, and the King's Killer, the actor that goes on, or is currently, at the time of the movie, um, he's in the show, the TV show, Game of Thrones, and he plays the character that's known as the King's Killer. So, spoiler alert on that, but you probably already know that he's the King's Killer. They introduce him as the King's Killer in the first season of Game of Thrones. So that actor is there, and that's really cool because I like that actor, the King's Killer in the Game of Thrones. And you got Morgan Freeman. You got other people too that I don't really know so much about, but they're there nonetheless. And they start to tell him who he is, and that he's actually a part of this rebellion, not to be confused with the rebellion in Star Wars. Sometimes rebellions are good. Sometimes you need to have a sit-in, like Rosa Parks did in the bus, in the real world, back in the 1950s or 1960s. And you can call that rebelling, being in a rebellion. But sometimes being in a rebellion is a good thing if you're in Star Wars, or if you're Rosa Parks, or if you're in this movie, Oblivion. And then somehow they decide how to fight back, and they find out that the one main person that they follow, like Tom Cruise and the lady, like they take commands from this voice, from this other lady from Titan. And Titan is the new world that they're gonna go to, and they're gonna live on, like a moon of Jupiter or Saturn. They take commands from this other lady, but it turns out that the other lady is just like a robot, I think. Spoiler alert, yeah, just a robot. Named Sally, I think. Not to be confused with Sally Field, who plays like a flying nun in one of the TV shows back in like the 1960s. And she plays the wife of Mrs. Doubtfire. And a bunch of other things too. So not to be confused with that Sally, there is the character named Sally in this movie Oblivion, and they take commands from her. But then it turns out I think she's just a robot, and so at the end of the movie, Tom Cruise goes up with like maybe some life forms. I mean, with his crew that are sleeping maybe. And so they're in like these time capsules in his spaceship, and the spaceship is going up out of Earth and going towards a spaceship that the Sally is in. Whether Sally is a person or a robot, I don't know exactly, but I think Sally is a robot. I think her name is Sally. It might be something else, but I think her name is Sally. And he's going towards her, and he has some flashbacks of previous missions, but that's okay. That doesn't stop him, and he keeps on going, and he's thinking about it, and then Sally kind of starts talking to him, and she says, I think you're lying. I can detect your voice and what kind of voice you have, and I think you're lying. And what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm delivering this life form, this survivor that I found, who is his wife, his real wife. He didn't know that at first, but then he finds out because that's what she tells him, and he believes her. Oh, you're my wife. So he's taking the survivor, supposedly taking the survivor to the big spaceship so that Sally can look at her, and maybe Sally will eat her or kill her or something horrible like that, which she wouldn't admit to that, but I think she's the bad person, and she's like, at first she's hostile, and she's like, what are you doing? I don't like what you're doing. I don't like the sound of your voice, Tom Cruise, The Last Samurai. I don't know what you're doing. But then she's like, okay, go ahead and land. So he lands, and then he's like, F you, Sally. And then like some probes go, and they shoot into her. And she's just like a big robot ball thing. She's just like a big probe thing. I think that's what Sally is. And Sally's trying to take over the world, like the Matrix. So it's like the Matrix all over again, with the robots trying to take over the world, or like apes in the planets of the apes, where the apes try to take over the world. You got robots taking over the world in Matrix, and you got apes trying to take over the world in the Planets of the Apes. You got aliens like Rita Repulsa and Lord Zed trying to take over the world in the Power Rangers. You're always having people trying to take over the world. All these different movies. Oh my, what are you gonna do? Blow them up. That's a pretty good solution. You see that in Independence Day, they blow up the aliens. Spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, that's what Will Smith and his friend does. Blow them up. Got a problem? Blow them up. And that's what they do. And the whole entire big spaceship blows up. And supposedly Tom Cruise dies. But then later on, back on Earth, the survivors are there. See, believe it or not, he didn't actually deliver his wife to Sally. He delivered Morgan Freeman to Sally. And Sally's like, these are not the droids I'm looking for. These are not the droids I'm looking for. That's a quote from Star Wars. These are not the droids we're looking for. This is not the body that I was asking for. Oh, too bad for you. This is Morgan Freeman. Dude. Oh. And then, boom, and then Sally gets blown up, and the whole spaceship gets blown up. Just like when the Death Star blows up in Star Wars. Spoiler alert, it happens twice. In the first movie that they made, it was actually the fourth movie, which is called A New Hope. The Death Star blows up, and then in the last movie, made in 1983, called The Return of the Jedi, they have the second Death Star, and that blows up too. And in this movie, Oblivion, a big spaceship blows up. And then you look in the sky and you see it blow up, and you're like, oh no, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader was on that spaceship. They're dead. I mean, no, that's Star Wars. But you look up there and you're like, oh no, Tom Cruise and Morgan Freeman was up there. But then at the end of the movie, back on Earth, you see the wife of Tom Cruise, and she has like a son, and she's just like in her nice little house surrounded by trees and a river and beautiful, but she's like a widow. But then all of a sudden you see Tom Cruise come out of nowhere. And I guess you don't see Morgan Freeman. That's okay. He's an old guy. And you could say no kids left behind, which is an act of trying to make sure people get through the educational system in America. Or don't leave no soldier behind, which is like like Saving Private Ryan. You got Tom Hanks going back for Matt Damon in that movie Saving Private Ryan. You know, don't leave anybody behind, kind of thing. You go back and try to save the day and try to carry your soldier back into the light. Don't leave anybody behind. But maybe they did leave Morgan Freeman behind. But maybe they had to, because they kind of had to leave Bruce Willis behind in the movie Armageddon. But then he saved the day and he blows up not a spaceship, but this big asteroid that is gonna go and or is it a comet? There's a big asteroid that's gonna blow up the Earth. So spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Armageddon, I just ruined it for you. I'm sorry. I'm a horrible person. But so was Sally. Sally was more horrible than me. Much more horrible. So you got Bruce Willis. He blows up the spaceship. No, he blows up an asteroid. So he's left behind. So he doesn't come back. And then you have Tom Cruise. He comes back, but then Morgan Freeman doesn't come back. So I guess he gets blown up maybe. Or they don't really say, or maybe I need to watch the movie again. But everybody lives happily ever after, the people on the earth, and forget about the people on Titus, on the moon, one of the moons of Saturn or Uranus or one of those big planets, Jupiter or Saturn. There's people up there on the moon, one of the biggest moons of those planets. So what about those people? What are they gonna do? Maybe they're gonna make a sequel or a prequel. Most likely a sequel. And they can explain it. Or they can just leave it open ended and who cares about what happens. But the moral of the story is if you have some hidden memories that you're not supposed to have, maybe there's something more behind it. Like maybe you really were in New York City and that you were lied to by Sally the robot, and you need to go back to Sally and blow her up and reunite with your wife on the real world and forget about the people on Titus. Forget about them. Forget about the people that live on a moon over around Jupiter. They can they can they can go suck themselves or whatever you want to say. And they can live by themselves and for themselves, and you can have the earth for yourself. That's the moral of the story. Stick with your guns, stick with your guts, stick with your intuition because you never know how valuable it might be in the long run.